Hello, this is part 2 of chapter 9. Today we're going to cover Central America, the Caribbean, and South America. So as we get started on Central America and the Caribbean, I just want you to know that this lesson in the book is very confusing because I think the book people put it together just because it was convenient and not really because they're that related. The Caribbean and Central America have very different cultures because their historical experiences were quite different. And as a result, we're going to be flipping back and forth, which might get a little confusing. So if you are having trouble following it, please come and see me before or after school and talk with me, and I can work you through it, because it can get a little confusing at times. So just let me know if you have questions. Maybe jot them down as you're going along. Just do your best. So let's get started with the people of Central America and the Caribbean. Most people in Central America are Mestizo, which remember is a mix between Indigenous and Europeans. There are also a large number of people who are of pure Indigenous descent. Many people in the Caribbean islands, on the other hand, are of African descent, since these islands had huge slave populations. Now, population densities vary depending on where you are. In Central America, these countries have very low population densities because they have very few people and they have a lot more land, whereas the Caribbean islands have higher populations on a smaller amount of land, which leads to very high population densities. So now let's talk about the history and government of the two subregions. Both the Caribbean and Central America had large indigenous populations before Europeans arrived. When the Spaniards conquered the areas, they put the indigenous people to work everywhere that they went. This resulted in large amounts of death. Disease, starvation, and hard labor killed many indigenous people. In fact, some of these groups completely were wiped out. All of these places were incorporated into the Spanish Empire. Some of the islands in the Caribbean were eventually conquered by different European groups. For example, Haiti was conquered by the French. The British came into Jamaica, which is why they speak a version of English there. Slaves in Haiti eventually overthrew their French owners in the Haitian Revolution. This revolution was very famous, and it struck fear in the heart of slave owners all over the Western Hemisphere, especially in the United States. And that would lead to big consequences for the slave populations in the United States being more and more oppressed because people were so afraid of slave uprisings overthrowing the country. Aside from Haiti, though, most Caribbean islands remained under Spanish control all the way to the end of the 1800s with the Spanish-American War. But in Central America, that wasn't the case. They broke away from Spain. But unlike many other Latin American countries, they did so peacefully. They formed a confederation, and the Spanish leader who was in charge there was actually in favor of the colonies forming this confederation. So it was a very peaceful transition. Unfortunately, this confederation didn't last very long, and it fell apart into the 5 independent countries that we see today. Many Caribbean islands and the Central American countries experienced frequent invasions during the 18 and 1900s by United States military forces. We would go in, our soldiers would go in to try and restore favorable governments in these countries. Oftentimes that meant supporting dictators who were in favor of supporting American companies. During that time also, the U.S. built the Panama Canal, which greatly changed how ships and shipping was able to be done in the Western Hemisphere. American support of dictators, though, was very controversial, and that often had a lot of pushback by the people. One example of that was in 1959 when Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba. He eventually would turn to communism and to the United States' arch rival, the USSR, the Soviet Union. Dictatorships were very common throughout this area until very recently, and they began to give way to democracies. Today, many nations continue to struggle with corruption, violence, and poverty, but most are some form of democracy. So, as we shift away from history, we'll come to culture. In terms of language and religion, Spanish is the primary language of most Central American countries. In the Caribbean, on the other hand, people speak a variety of languages: Spanish, English, French, and Dutch, all different languages that were brought in by different invaders as they came through the area. Many islands have their own dialects of these languages. A dialect is a form of a language, and they kind of made it their own. It mixed with whatever other languages were there, and it formed a very distinct sounding part of the language. Many people are bilingual, but others speak only one form of Patois, which is a dialect that blends Indigenous, European, African, and Asian languages all together. It's kind of like a big thing of soup of different languages coming together to form one new one. Most people in these areas are Roman Catholics, but there are also some Protestants, especially in English and Dutch-speaking countries. For the people, the quality of education varies greatly from country to country, as well as within the country. So in rural areas, often education is worse than it is in urban areas. Healthcare depends on how much money is in the community or the country. Some countries have excellent healthcare, other ones have very poor healthcare. It just depends. Just like Mexico, indigenous art, music, and clothing styles continue to influence modern trends in Central America and the Caribbean islands. And as in Mexico, the extended family is also very important. Baseball, which American soldiers brought when they invaded their countries, was brought to many Caribbean islands, as well as basketball and volleyball. These sports are very popular throughout the Caribbean. Now let's move on to South America, this massive continent, which we're going to cover real quick. There are a whole bunch of countries in it, so it's going to go by kind of fast. So it's a lot of information, just a very general overview. Now, the people of South America. Large numbers of indigenous cultures still exist, especially in the Andes region of Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. This was a culture hearth long ago, and so those cultures still continue despite all the conflict that they've experienced. Additionally, Africans, Asians, and Europeans at one time or another represent important immigrant groups who have come to the continent over the course of its recent history. Most people live on the continent's edges or along the coast in an area that's sometimes called the Populated Rim. The interior of the continent is dominated by mountains, forests, deserts, and rainforests. It's not a very great place to live. It's hard to live in a lot of these places, so people generally stay and have stayed closer to the edges where it's easier to survive. South American countries tend to have very low population densities. They have a large amount of area and a fairly low population, which leads to a very low density. Cities in South America often show a huge gap between the wealthy and the poor people of the country. For example, in the favelas, which are crowded slums in Brazil, they contrast significantly from the gated communities of the wealthy. Now let's shift and talk about history and government. A variety of complex indigenous societies developed in the Andes, culminating with the Inca, who built one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. Inca society was highly structured, with nobles, peasants, and soldiers ruling over the lower classes of farmers and artisans, which are people who do various tasks. The ruling class forced the lower classes to work periodically for the emperor in a system called the Mita. Because the Inca had been decimated by disease and had experienced a prolonged civil war, Spanish conquistadors and their indigenous allies that they made when they came in conquered the Inca and put themselves in charge of this Mita system. So instead of the Inca emperors getting the lower classes to work for them, now they had the Spanish rulers getting the Inca classes to work for them. South America became part of either the Spanish Empire or the Portuguese Empire. Spain and Portugal then began exploiting the natural resources on behalf of their colonial empires. They would take the natural resources back to the home country and make those people very wealthy. Most of these countries fought for independence, and that occurred when Napoleon invaded Spain and caused this whole big mess with who was in charge of the country. Brazil, on the other hand, which was part of Portugal, the Portuguese Empire, achieved independence more gradually and peacefully. Unfortunately, following independence, the wealthy elite and different caudillos often violently struggled for power. They would come in and they would take over. There weren't any questions asked, and they didn't really show much mercy either. Repeated dictatorships, and then kind of oscillating between dictatorships and democracy, slowed the development of democracy throughout the 1800s and the 1900s. Today, democracies have been established in most South American nations, but they often struggle with poverty, corruption, and violence. In terms of culture, again, we're talking in really big generalities about this continent. People in South America primarily speak Spanish or Portuguese, but some people speak indigenous languages, French, and Dutch. Again, most South Americans, like Central Americans, Mexicans, and people from the Caribbean are Roman Catholic. Education varies around the continent depending on how much money is available to support schools in that particular country, in that particular area. And the same with healthcare. Healthcare varies depending on how much money is in the community. Oftentimes, poor people do not have access to adequate healthcare. In terms of arts and music and culture, the indigenous roots, the Spanish roots, and the Portuguese roots of various cultural elements continue to be seen in art, music, and architecture. So that concludes part 2, which was about the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. We covered a huge amount of Latin America in just a few minutes. It went by really fast. So again, this is a very, very brief overview. I hope you learned some interesting things. We'll talk a lot more about some of these historical experiences and how they fit into a bigger picture in the very near future. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. Have a great day.